Welcome to my series on ecology, where we'll study the interactions among living things and their surroundings. Big topics to examine include levels of organization, food webs, and energy transfer. So let's check it out. Ecology also has its own levels of organization. You're already familiar with smaller levels, like going from atoms to molecules, molecules to cells, cells making up tissues, tissues making up organs, organs working all together to make organ systems, and once you have organ systems coordinating, you have an organism. So that's really where ecology starts. It starts at the level of the organism or the individual. So taking this example here in this picture, we're starting with this moose or this deer, whatever you want to call it, and if you have a bunch of individuals, then that makes up a population of deer. And once you have a bunch of populations all interacting with one another, you might have deer working together with this bull moose over here and this wolf or beaver or this owl. Then you have a community of animals or species. And then zooming out even broader or to a higher level or to a bigger level, you have an ecosystem. So a bunch of communities working all together, interacting with one another, makes an ecosystem. A bunch of ecosystems will make up a biome, which is a large territory or mass of land. Like a tundra or chaparral or desert, we'll discuss those. And once you have a bunch of biomes put together, you have something known as a biosphere. So those are the levels of organization in ecology. An ecosystem includes both biotic and abiotic factors. So if you reflect back to your Greek roots and your understanding of it, the Greek root bio means life, and the prefix a means without. So that can help you remember that biotic just means all the living things. So that would include animals, plants, fungus, minera, and protists. And your abiotic factors would include things like moisture, temperature, humidity, climate, rocks, soil, all the non-living things. Biodiversity is the assortment or the variety of living things in an ecosystem. So for example, tropical rainforests have a large biodiversity. It's got a wide range of different species and animals, flora and fauna and plant species, and they all interact with one another, so it creates a large biodiversity. Many factors affect biodiversity. So for example, if you lose a keystone species, or a species that has an unusually large effect on an ecosystem, this causes a ripple effect. An example of a keystone species and this ripple effect can be illustrated with beavers. So beavers are known for building dams, and when they make their dams, they create ponds, or a wetland ecosystem. So when you have ponds, you allow birds and ducks to come in because you're creating nesting sites for them, as well as an increased fish population. You have more fish, then you have a bigger food web. So some of these birds, like larger birds, might feed on fish, beavers might eat fish, fish eat insects, so on and so forth. So you create this big food web and this big ecosystem. But if you take away beavers, then the whole entire ecosystem collapses. You're going to see that the principles of ecology just overlap what we studied in photosynthesis and cell respiration. It's basically the same thing, except it's zoomed out on a larger scale and a bigger level. So we're going to study the interactions between producers and autotrophs, which are plants that perform photosynthesis to make their own energy and food, and also create food for heterotrophs or consumers that rely on eating plants and other animals for their own energy. So it's basically just photosynthesis and cell respiration, but zoomed out to the level of an ecosystem. We also can't forget to mention chemosynthesis, which is making energy without the form of sunlight, so using chemicals instead. And this is prevalent in deep sea hydrothermal vents where it's really dark and you can't get sunlight. So these organisms rely on using chemosynthesis to produce energy, to produce sugar. Let's understand the difference between a food chain and a food web. So in a food chain, you're really only looking at the relationship from one producer to a single chain of consumers. So in that picture there, you have corn or maize, which is a producer, and it makes food for a primary consumer, followed by a secondary consumer, and finally a tertiary consumer. So it's the simplest way to look at energy transfer in an ecosystem. There are a few types of consumers. You have herbivores, which eat only plants, carnivores, which eat only animals or meat, and omnivores, which eat both plants and animals. And finally, you have the bottom feeders of the food chain. things like detritivores, which eat dead organic matter, and decomposers, like fungus and bacteria, which are responsible for breaking down dead things and returning nutrients back into the ecosystem. And lastly, a food web is basically a food chain, except it's on steroids. So it's a little bit more advanced and complex. So for example, if you look at the food web that's on the left there and you zone in on just the rodent, you can see how the rodent has many feeding relationships. It eats all the different types of insects, but when you trace the food web back to the original source, it always goes back to some sort of producer, where it's like a plant or some sort of organism that performs photosynthesis. The cycling of matter is also very important when we're studying ecosystems. So not only do we look at how energy is transferred between organisms like autotrophs and heterotrophs, we also need to understand the water cycle, or the hydrologic cycle. Okay, next we'll also look at the carbon and oxygen, nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, but we'll start off with this one first because I think it's easiest for students to understand. So we look at the ocean starts to evaporate, and this produces clouds, and the clouds will then travel inland. So it travels inland, and then you get rainfall, which is known as precipitation. So this creates runoff, surface level runoff, where the rainwater will find its way back down the mountain, and there's surface flow, which might produce large lakes, and from the lakes you get more evaporation, so you get this continuous cycle of water becoming steam condensing and then becoming rainfall. But some of that water is then trapped as groundwater, so it goes below the surface, and this groundwater then flows back out into the ocean. So you get a lot of these different pathways. It's all circular, however. Okay, so from the lake or the stream you get evaporation, and you get deposition, and deposition is gaseous water becoming ice, so it skips the liquid phase. And then you also have sublimation, which is ice becoming gaseous water or steam, and then you get this continued flow of evaporation, precipitation, you get it back as water then evaporates some more, and you just get this circular pathway. So that's known as a hydrologic cycle. So the carbon and oxygen cycle is basically the same discussion that we've had on photosynthesis and cell respiration. So you can see where this is headed. So plants take in sunlight and carbon dioxide as well as water to produce sugar, and they release oxygen in the process. Animals need oxygen, they need to breathe it in order to perform cellular respiration. And the picture that's above my head to the right of your screen, you start to see more human interactions as well in the carbon cycle. So humans will burn, or they'll combust fossil fuels, things like oil and coal, to produce energy to drive their cars and whatnot, and machines and factories. The atmospheric CO2 is then assimilated by plants and animals. So you have the continuation of photosynthesis, cell respiration. Animals will die off. They also produce waste when they're alive. Okay, and then you get this whole interaction with consumers, producers. You also have detritivores and decomposers all in the mix. Okay, and then in the process, as animals die, they get buried deep beneath the Earth's crust, and then over millions of years, you get the formation of fossil fuels, things like peat, coal, and oil, and then these are then dug up again, and the whole cycle continues over and over and over. It's probably not too important to understand all the details, but you also have the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, because those are two elements which are important in making amino acids and proteins and just vital functions of living things. So in the nitrogen cycle, okay, you have atmospheric nitrogen, which plants can't really take in. So you have animals that produce waste in the form of ammonia, and ammonia has the chemical formula NH3, and this is incorporated easily by denitrifying bacteria. So it's bacteria that decomposes the ammonia to produce their own energy, and in the process of doing so, they produce nitrogen, which is used in a form by plants. Because plants can't assimilate atmospheric nitrogen for their own use, they rely on decomposers to make this sort of nitrogen that's easily assimilated through their roots. So things like nitrate, nitrite, those are things that can be used by plants. And plants need those as essential elements to support their growth. And next up, we also have the phosphorus cycle. So in the phosphorus cycle, you have plants and animals and decomposers working all together to produce phosphate. And phosphate is also an important nutrient. It's used to support plant growth. So this is important in the ecosystem, in the environment, these two cycles here. I want to end this video with a discussion on something called the 10% rule on energy transfer and efficiency. So we have two pictures side by side, and hopefully this can help you understand it. But at the base of this energy pyramid, you have producers, and they take in sunlight and they're able to use it 100% effectively or efficiently. But as these producers are consumed by your first level consumers, for example, like a bunny rabbit, they only get to use 10% of that available energy, because a lot of that energy is used inefficiently and it's lost in the form of heat. So as a bunny rabbit gets eaten by a snake, okay, let's say the rabbit and his whole entire body can provide you with 1,000 kilocalories of energy. The snake only receives 10% of that. It can only use 10% of what was available from that bunny rabbit. So really, it only receives 100 kilocalories. Now, your third level consumers, your eagle or your hawk, will then swoop in, kill the snake, eat the snake, and let's say the snake provides 100 kilocalories worth of energy. The eagle or the hawk really only receives 10% of that energy, because in the process of digestion, it loses a lot of that energy in the form of heat. So it's called the 10% rule. So at each level, you're only receiving 10% of the available energy.